play, you know, and they know it's completely stylized and they don't take it seriously. This is done with a kind of grim, relentless realism. He's flogged and flayed for 10 or 12 minutes at a time in close-up, in slow motion, with all the resources, you know, of cinema, including the music that you heard in the clip behind it. And I'll be damned, literally, I suppose, if there's any spiritual meaning in that.
I'll come to you in a
second. You're undermining my call for a boycott, I'm afraid, Mr. Denby. I was hoping to keep people away, and now you're encouraging all the sickos to flock into the movie. But you're quite right in what you say. I mean, it's very strange to me that Mel Gibson, who's also spent a lot of his time making very vulgar and persecuting remarks about homosexuals, would appear to want to make a movie that's an appeal to the gay Christian sadomasochistic niche market. But I don't pretend to understand the lurid mind of this guy.
Do you really think that's where he is?
I should say, in case I was misunderstood the first time, I don't think it is for Jews, in other words, to be condemning the movie. It's for Christians to say, this is not what our faith means to us. That it isn't supposed to be an incitement of unreason. Or at least let's hope that they would want to say that.
John?
Well, as a not particularly successful Christian, let me say that. And in the event people don't follow the Hitchens boycott idea, there are two very important points I think should be made. One is that the use of Aramaic and Latin makes the movie unfold at a kind of documentary remove that I think confers a deceptive kind of authority on what's going on. It puts Gibson in the position of interpreter and translator of the most important story in Western history. And I think people should be careful there. And leaving aside the violence for a second, I think it's very, very important to remember that the Jews are not to blame for the death of Jesus. The Roman Empire executed Jesus of Nazareth on a charge of sedition. There were two other people already ready for capital punishment, had been tried and were ready to be executed on that day. And we all know what has happened in the past for 2 millennia when people have blamed the Jewish people disproportionately for what happened in the year 30 A.D.
Christopher, I think you're right about it. All of this talk is doing nothing but putting people in theater seats. I mean, whatever boycott talk you were trying to lead is going to fall on deaf ears because of programs like this and cover stories like Newsweek, and because it is the greatest story.
I guess by writing about it myself, I've encouraged this.
Exactly
just
right.
On the point, on the Aramaic point Mr. Meacham makes, and his excellent essay in Newsweek refers to as well. Mr. Gibson claims to have removed from his film the chant by a group of Jewish people saying, "Let his blood be upon us and on our children forever." We learned this morning. In fact, he hasn't removed that scene from the film. It is still there in Aramaic. He's just cut the subtitle. So that
if you know Aramaic, then you'll hear it.
I'm sorry. I mean, when it's played in Syria and Egypt, and when it's taken around the world, where we know that anti-Semitism is not just a metaphorical or metaphysical threat, anyone who wants to can put the subtitle right over the Aramaic, and the scene is still there. Gibson said he'd taken it out. He lied about this. He assured many rabbis he'd removed it. He hasn't. He just trimmed the subtitle. This is a guy whose word is worth absolutely nothing, and who knows perfectly well. When the Pope went to Damascus a few months ago, he was greeted by President Assad, who said to the Pope in front of the Grand Mosque in Damascus, "We have a common enemy. We hate the Jews who killed your Christ." Now, the Quran actually says Jesus was not executed on the cross. So Assad was also spitting on his own holy book, as it happens. But believers will sometimes do that if they're fanatical enough, as Gibson clearly is.
Assad said that to the Pope?
Assad said exactly that to the Pope. In other words, this is not small stakes that we're playing for. When that film gets shown in that region, as you can bet it will be, as Gibson knows it will be, that statement is still in it in Aramaic, and they can put any subtitle on it they want. And yes, that's what Assad said to the Pope, even though the Quran specifically does not blame the Jewish people.
I've loaded this up, and I didn't mean to do it this way, David, in terms of 3 people who have... No, stay with me, Christopher. 3 people who have strong feelings about this. My impression is you like the movie.
Well, I think it's a very well-made movie. Yeah, I mean, Mel Gibson is a good movie director. He's shown that before. Caleb Deschanel is a sensational cinematographer, as David Denby said before. I think that Jim Caviezel gives a really strong, kind of relentlessly focused performance. It's a good movie in that sense. I also think, and by the way, I share like just about all of the misgivings which have been stated here tonight, and I've written so. But I think it's a more interesting movie in some ways, especially cinematically and also historically, than has been coming out so far in a lot of the discussion about it, because there are so many different ways to think about it. For example, something that has been mentioned here tonight briefly is the idea that Mel Gibson seems repeatedly drawn not just to violence but to suffering in his movies. Braveheart is Exhibit A, but there are plenty other examples. And one might look at that positively and say that, well, he's always been interested in the suffering hero, the Christ-like figure in secular surroundings. Now he is simply, carrying that over into his religious interests. But one could also flip it around and say that he just has a morbid fascination with violence and suffering, and that by wrapping in religion, he can push it farther than he ever has before and get away with it.
Someone expressed that earlier here tonight.
Well, I certainly agree with the last part.
That he has a morbid obsession with
violence, and he's found a religious cover, a guise for it, and which operates for the people who go to the movie thinking this is a great religious experience. How do you explain to your 10-year-old, and there are families coming in by the thousands, that watching a man chained up and flayed to death for 2 hours is a deeply religious experience? Yeah, I mean, it's very disturbing for
the
children.
idea of taking children to see this, I think, is insane. But, one more point about the movie is that I think that it is an interesting history lesson, and I don't mean the history of Jesus and his life and death. I think it's an interesting history lesson and reminder in terms of Christian history, because there has, after all, been a great cult of death running through certain strains of Christianity, evidently including the one that Mel Gibson is most interested in. And, one can go and visit ossuaries in Europe and see bones wrapped up like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre or something. And I think that this movie, precisely by its relentless and merciless physicality, its apparent idea that what happens to the earthly body of Jesus is what counts, and what happened afterwards, the resurrection, gets 1 minute at the end of the film. There is a strain of this running through Christianity, and it's kind of a medieval strain. And I think it's kind of interesting to be re-reminded of that.
What do we make of the marketing effort by Mel Gibson in terms of the way he has presented this to a whole range of groups who have bought, blocks of tickets to see the movie, and the appeal that he hopes it'll make? Is this simply a very keen marketing mind at work, or is it something else?
I was driving through Tennessee this morning, and all the radio stations were tuned to this subject, and they had an interview with Gibson, like apparently it's being relayed everywhere, where he says, "This is the end of my career. I'll never work again. I've been so brave.
Is this the Diane Sawyer interview or something else?
I've martyred myself. It's a career-ending thing." They said, "Well, how can you say that?" And he said, "Well, you know what Hollywood's like." And by the way, if people don't understand what he's implying there, they should. He in fact was able to build very cleverly a publicity strategy of upsetting and alarming the Jewish community, and then inviting to prepared screenings only groups of extreme conservative Christian and some Jewish fundamentalists, and preventing people like myself. It took me ages to get hold of a pirate copy of the film. Magazines have taken interest in the movie industry from seeing it at all. It's a very, very cynical strategy, designed for profit, and crowned by his self-pityingly saying it'll put him out of business, but he doesn't care because he's doing it all for Jesus. Evidently he wants to feel pain. I think it's about time that he did.
I certainly agree with that, but I must say that I think the claim that he might suffer in Hollywood is absolutely preposterous. And just for one exhibit, I would point to Martin Scorsese. The Last Temptation of Christ outraged a lot more people, a lot more, I think, than this movie is doing, for different reasons, for kind of opposite reasons. Right. It didn't slow down Martin Scorsese. It certainly didn't slow down Willem Dafoe, who played Jesus in that movie. Of course, these are not major Hollywood players like Mel Gibson. They're people who operate sort of alongside the system, but they're still very much reliant on that system, and they've stayed there.
But I think on the marketing question, there's clearly an alliance of literalists. whether it's the very traditionalist, out of the mainstream Catholic, or many, many evangelical Protestants. And I think what's happening to some extent is there are millions and millions of Americans who believe that this is the way the story happened. And what they found